Advita, a lot of PR professionals, and I actually think this happens to everyone in every profession, every walk of life, but they describe what they feel in certain rooms as imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that just how some of us are, that some of us are more prone to imposter syndrome, or are there other dynamics at play here?
Such a good question. And I have to be very honest with both of you and the folks who are listening. I was actually one of those individuals that described everything as a bit of an imposter syndrome. And after doing the research I've done in confidence and self-doubt and self-esteem, I strongly believe that we've turned it into a bit of a catch-all explanation for every moment that we feel around self-doubt. And I think in doing that, we've made it into a bit of a personal problem, when actually in my research and studies that I've done, most of the imposter that we feel is often a structural one. So when you're walking into a room and you feel that you don't belong in that room, my big thing to anyone that I work with, and the first question I will ask is, does the room reflect you? Now, feeling like an imposter in a new job, in a new project is common. Continuing to feel like an imposter, feeling like a fraud, is not as common, and everyone does experience it. I know initially it was associated to women, but it is something that everyone does associate, and the reason more women speak about it is because often the room doesn't reflect them.
That's so interesting. So it's not just an internal issue that people are kind of internalizing. It's much more, it starts off with the external environment. Do you think organizations are aware of that? And do you think even people who feel that they're struggling with imposter syndrome, do you think they're aware of that? Because I don't think I was until...
No, not at all. No one's aware. Like, it's so interesting, which is why I focus so much energy on confident workplaces. Confidence is something that a lot of folks do believe is a personal issue. And it's something that you either have or you don't have. That's a conversation that I often have with folks. And it's not. Confidence is a skill. It's a skill like anything else that you would learn to do. Nobody is born being confident. There are moments when the environment will help you be more confident. Of course it will. Your privileges will help you be more confident, your power to an extent. But generally it is a skill that you can build. And I do think it's a lot of folks don't recognize it as a skill. And we talk a lot around feeling like a fraud or feeling like we don't belong. And a lot of leaders often will say to me when I'm brought in to work with some of these folks is, oh, she's not as confident to be a director. We want her to be more confident. And my question is, what are you doing in the environment to help them be more confident? Like, because it has to work both ways. We have to recognize our strengths and our opportunities, but the organizations need to recognize what part they play in that as well.
Okay, let me put you both on the spot here. Talk about uncomfortable. What room do you find you are most comfortable in, and what room do you find you have imposter syndrome or you are the least comfortable in? Farzana, just for fun, I want to start with you.
Sure.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I would say that if I know the people, if they make me feel safe, if I feel that they have my back, if I feel that they will view me fairly, and I think, and without bias, if the people I'm going to walk into the room and see if they are kind of evolved people, you know, if they have self-awareness, if they are aware of bias, if they lean into it rather than kind of attack it and distance themselves from sort of privilege. I think that's the kind of people that make me feel safe, and when that's lacking, then I'm sort of guarded.
For me, it used to be if it was fairly represented, and it still is to an extent. You know, is the room fairly represented? Do I see other people like me in the room? Now, in the profession that we work in PR and communications, it's rare. I have to admit, when I go into senior leadership conversations to see people like myself, and you mentioned in the introduction that I was the first South Asian woman to be president of CIPR. In fact, I was the first person of colour in the 70-odd year history to be president of CIPR. the reason behind that was because when you see someone like you represented, you instantly feel like you do belong and you will be heard. And I echo Fazana's sentiment in having that space where you know that you'll be listened and the power dynamics won't influence how you are seen and how you are made to belong. Now, since my confidence journey, the big part for me is my expertise and my credibility help me belong in that room, and that's my self-advocacy work that I've done on myself, and for me to remind myself I belong in that space just as much as everybody else, and it's my role in that room to make sure that my credibility does shine. And I've got tactics and techniques in order to manage conversations that exclude me or dismiss me, and I think when you know those techniques and tactics, it's much easier.
Okay, what are they? Sorry, you brought them up. I got to pull that thread.
No, absolutely. So it's understanding, because what I will say about the exclusion element of being in a room is everyone expects it to be somebody who's like a villain, who is, you know, horrible, nasty person who's excluding everybody. That's not the case. 99% of the time, that's not the case. You're looking at people who overtalk, people who have a ego, people who have a power dynamic challenge, people who are really enthusiastic and really want to get their point across but don't hear anybody else around them. For you as an individual, you need to assess the situation. Is it a leader who is just enthusiastic and doesn't see or hear people because they're just getting carried away with their vision? Or is it somebody who is uncomfortable with challenge? Is it somebody who just doesn't see or hear anything around them anymore? Once you identify what the opportunity is for you, you can reframe the conversation. So if it is somebody who is over enthusiastic and really over the top with their presence as not hearing anybody, then you can say, and a tactical thing is to say, I have 5 or 3 things I need to raise. Please, could you give me grace to just say that? And then I would love to hear your point of view. Now, that takes courage. I'm not saying that's easy, and it depends on hierarchy in the room. But ultimately, if you going into those conversations and people are not listening to you, then you need to ask the question about what is it that you can do within the control you have to change that. And if you don't have the hierarchy or the power, then who do you have in your world that can help you be there and get there? So is there a peer, is there a colleague, is there a senior leader who can help manage that conversation with you, where they can give that feedback that would be received well? But we always make the assumption that the person who's dominating the conversation is this nasty, evil person, and they're rarely not. In my experience, they're just somebody who's just not been coached in the right way, doesn't recognize what influence they're having, doesn't realize the impact they're demonstrating, and we need to kind of gauge that and understand that before we can contribute.
Now, Advita, I've worked with you in many different rooms, you know, in the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, in the Asian Communications Network. I follow you on Instagram, you know, and you just seem to be the epitome of confidence. You walk into a room, you deliver these incredible keynotes, sort of speeches around the world. For those who are listening, who feel that they have a confidence gap, what advice would you give them that has really helped you over the years? Because I remember you mentioning to me that you didn't always start out like this confident go-getter. You had to build yourself up. What advice would you give to our community?
Great question. And yes, I didn't. If you knew me before 2018, I was not the person that I am today. I spent a lot of my time doubting my abilities, waiting for validation, waiting for permission, waiting to be invited into conversations. And when you wait for those things to happen, they rarely do, unless somebody pays attention to what's going on. And I'm going to be honest, you know, we're not people who have you know, we're busy people with lots going on around us, and no matter what your intent is, we do sometimes forget that there are things going on around us that we could help other people. So you have to be intentional. One of the biggest things and the biggest piece of advice I'll give to folks is get to know yourself well. Get to know who you are well. Because when you know yourself well, there isn't anything that anyone can say to you or do to you that will kick you away from your path. And that's the number one thing I did for myself. I learned to understand where my strengths were, where my genius lies, what my values were, what my purpose was, what legacy did I want to leave behind, what support did I want to give to others, and what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. And then how do I plug the gap in that? And recognizing, understanding that about myself really pushed me into the next phase of my life, which is advocating for myself. And understanding that I can't be everybody's cup of tea, otherwise I will be a mug. And I say that all the time, that I went through this chronic people-pleasing phase where I wanted every single person to like me, and trying to get everyone to like me did myself injustice. And I didn't show up as my best self in those situations because I was so busy adapting and crafting out my identity that I thought that other person would value from me, rather than leaning in on who I was and what I needed. Which is why I wrote the book, just happened to have it right next to me, The 7 Habits of Confident Leaders, because I've been observing, researching, studying leaders in what makes a confident leader. It isn't the bold, extroverted individual, it's that person who knows themselves really well.
And could you just talk us through what are the 7 habits?
So the 7 habits sit under the mnemonic believe, which is, if you don't believe in yourself, you can't expect anyone else to believe in you. So it's about boldness, it's about empathy, it's about learning, it's about integrity, it's about empowerment, it's about vulnerability. And the most important habit, in my opinion, and the one that I really focus on and ask other people to focus on, is energy. Because when your energy isn't where you need it to be and your mental health is being impacted, you can't deliver against those 6 other habits.
Now,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, Doug, Advita gave me some really good advice once about energy. And so, Advita, could you tell Doug what you told me about keeping these energy files?
Energy audits. Yeah, so every 6 months I do an energy audit, and apologies to friends, colleagues, people are listening, but it's an important thing to do. So I list every single person I know in my life and the other person I'm in contact with, and rate them out of 10 in terms of how much energy they consume. Not to exclude them out of my life, not to distance myself from them, but just to understand what boundaries I may need to put in place, what things I need to do to make sure that I keep my energy sustainable. So if there's a meeting that you go into and there's a couple of individuals that drain you, then what you may want to do is put in contingencies after that conversation that elevates your energy again, or make sure that you don't back yourself back to back in meetings, because that meeting's going to take a lot away from you. Knowing where your energy is consumed and where your energy is thriving is critically important for our success.
It sounds like the mother-in-law index, but I won't go there. One of the things that I'm drawing from you about leaders, and this I think this should be fairly intuitive, is that even at a one-to-one level, it's the leader's job to make the room comfortable for each individual person. The so-called open door policy, even if that's not a literal open door, it's that you can approach me, you can admit something, you can tell me something, but for heaven's sakes, don't let me be surprised by something. It sounds like that's the role of leadership here.
It is the leader's responsibility in making sure that the environment is safe for everybody around them, regardless of their background and their demographic. They hold the power. Often leaders hold the power, and they have a role and a duty of care, in my opinion, to make sure that they're creating an environment where people can be their best selves. But the reason I wrote the book for leaders is because leaders often mask their own insecurities. And when they mask their own insecurities, the toxic leadership traits show up, such as micromanaging. We've all had a leader that's micromanaged and been really pernickety about the stuff we're doing. And often it's because they're so worried and their imposter inner critic is crying out. So it's just managing and understanding, actually, what is my role as a leader in this room to make sure that everybody has a space to be their best self. And there's red flags that you can spot. People not speaking up, people fearing, questioning, people not raising their ideas. Those kind of things often give you a clue whether or not that space is there where people can be their confident self.
And likewise, a self-audit. Have I made the room comfortable for as many people as I can? Leadership is not just the CEO, you know, the CCO. Leadership is all of us. We all have that capacity to do that.
Yeah, 100%. We need to take accountability. We're so lack at taking accountability, and I don't think it helps that we've got so many global leaders who don't take accountability, and we're not getting that, you know, that trust ultimately. And I think it's almost giving permission to leaders not to take that accountability and not to be vulnerable and not to lead with empathy. All of those things are missing, and all of those things is what helps you be more confident.
I just wanted to ask one question, Advita. You said earlier on that it's really important to know yourself, and know thyself is one of is as old as time. How do you do it? What are the sort of practical steps? Because everyone talks about it, but actually you've gone through a rigorous self-analysis over the years.
Yeah.
What did you practically do? What can people do if they want to understand themselves better? Who makes them, thrive, and who makes them go into their shell, what their strengths and weaknesses are? Because sometimes people don't have the self-awareness, and sometimes they don't always have people around them who will tell them, what their reality of them is.
Yeah. So it's what I will say. It isn't easy work. It is uncomfortable because you're having to recondition everything that you've learned. But the practical tips I will give to folks is understanding your values. When I did my values work, we talk about values quite a lot from an organizational perspective, an agency perspective, a business perspective, but we don't talk about values, our own values, the personal values. When you know your values, you understand what your trigger points are, why do you react in a certain way, that can really help you understand yourself better. That was the first thing I did, my values work. The second thing I did was understand my communication preference. What is it about me and how do I like to communicate? And then what can I dial up and dial down depending on the people around me? Because I used to believe that if somebody thought differently to me or reacted differently to me, they were idiots, let's be honest, like they don't get it. I don't want them in my life, like they're just really hard work. But understanding my communication preference and how I like to work and how others like to work helped me close the conflict gap in conversations and relationships I was building as well. And I think that's something that we need to be quite mindful of as well. And then the other thing is, one of the biggest things I did for myself is not giving myself a hard time. I stopped talking negatively. I punished myself so much previously, and I used to really have this self-negative talk that just completely destroyed my self-esteem. And it wasn't everybody else around me, it was me doing it to me. So I made a promise to myself that going forward, I was no longer going to have this negative self-talk. And it may seem a bit woo-woo and people are like, oh yeah, whatever. But you'll be, you start tracking how many times a day do you give yourself a hard time. And I can guarantee it's much more than you think it is. And we have to be really kind to ourselves, because if we're not kind to ourselves and we don't treat ourselves like we would the person that we love the most, then we can't give that to anybody else. We have to appreciate who we are and what we bring into this world. Everything, greatness and not the great stuff, and appreciate that every day we're learning more about who we are.
I love that, Advita. So what you're saying, to close the confidence gap, the key is kindness. Kindness to those in the room and kindness to the self.
Yeah. Because, people think kindness is a weakness. People think that it doesn't allow them to be assertive, it doesn't allow them to be dominant, it doesn't allow them to lead. It's absolute nonsense. Kindness is demonstrating that you have got empathy for the people who you may not recognize their lived experience, but you can definitely empathize and support and listen. We're terrible at listening. We're terrible at observing. We're working in such a fast-paced world. Every single moment of our time is a distraction through the social media, through the technology that we've got around us. I advise folks just to slow down and steady their pace a little bit and just to look what's going on around them and how they feel about that. And that will definitely reduce the conflict gap that I spoke about, help boost your confidence, give you the self-esteem, and most critically help you help others be their best self.
Love that.
What a
Absolutely
feel-good
love it.
episode, eh? It just makes you feel better in the last 20 minutes. Advita, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me.